Midnight horror stories. These are the stories people tell quietly, late at night, to the one person they trust. Tonight, you're that person. Turn off the lights.
The deckhand. I've worked commercial fishing in Alaska for 22 years. I want to tell you what's out there. Not the weather, though the weather will kill you and has killed people I worked alongside. Not the mechanical failures, though those will kill you too, and have. And I've been close enough to that particular edge to know what it feels like to be on the wrong side of a sea condition your boat wasn't built for. Not any of the ordinary dangers of the work, which are substantial and real, and which most people who've never been on a commercial fishing vessel in Alaskan waters have no accurate picture of. What I want to tell you about is what lives in those waters and along those shores that has no name in any chart I've ever read, no entry in any fisheries database, no acknowledgement in any maritime authority document I've ever come across, despite the fact that the people who work those waters have been encountering it for as long as people have worked those waters, which in some cases means generations, and in the case of the Alaska Native communities whose relationship with those coasts goes back far longer than the commercial fishing industry, means something much older than that. 22 years. I've worked crab in the Bering Sea, halibut in the Gulf of Alaska, salmon in Prince William Sound, and in waters further west and further north that I'm not going to name specifically for reasons I'll explain as I go. I've been on vessels ranging from a 42-foot bow picker in my first season to a 160-foot processor in my 14th. I've worked as deckhand, as deck boss, as first mate on 3 separate vessels, and for the last 6 years as captain of a vessel I own with a partner, which means the decisions are mine and the responsibility is mine and the things that happen on the water on my watch are my account to give. I grew up in a fishing family in the Pacific Northwest. My father worked the salmon fleet before I was born and came back to it whenever he needed to, which was often. I grew up hearing the water talked about the way farmers talk about land, as a thing that provides and a thing that takes and a thing that has a character that you'd better understand if you intend to spend your life in relationship with it. I didn't grow up hearing that the water had things in it that didn't have names. Nobody talked about that. You learned about that later, if you learned about it at all, usually from someone older on a vessel in a season when something happened that required either an explanation or a silence, and the silence was the more common of the two. I'm going to give you the explanation, or as much of an explanation as I have, which is the account of what I've seen and heard and experienced across 22 years of working some of the most remote and least trafficked waters on the surface of this planet. Not the tourist Alaska, not the cruise ship Alaska. The working Alaska, the commercial Alaska, the parts of the coastline that don't appear in any travel magazine, and that most Alaskans who live in Anchorage or Fairbanks have never seen, where the nearest town might be a float plane right away and the nearest other vessel might be 12 miles off your port side on a clear day and invisible the rest of the time. The first thing happened in my 3rd season. I was crewing on a crab vessel working the Bering Sea in late fall, a 110-foot boat with a crew of 5, including the captain, who was a man named Halverson. I'm not going to use full names in this account, for reasons that will become clear, with 20 years of Bering Sea experience and the specific, deeply settled quality of authority that people who have been genuinely tested by their profession for 20 years eventually develop. He ran a good vessel. He ran it safely and he ran it professionally, and he was the kind of captain whose decisions you trusted not because you were obligated to trust them, but because his track record of being right was long enough that trust had become the only rational position. We were pulling pots in conditions that were marginal, 15 to 18-foot seas, 25-knot winds, not unusual for the Bering in November, but requiring attention, when the radar showed something that Halverson looked at for a long time, without saying anything. I was at the rail hauling, and the boat's movement was absorbing most of my attention, but I noticed him looking at the radar screen with a quality of focus that was different from his ordinary monitoring of the display. He didn't call anything out. He watched whatever he was watching for close to 4 minutes by my count, and then it was gone from the display, and he went back to running the vessel as though nothing had happened. An hour later, during a brief weather pause when we'd stopped to assess conditions, I asked him about it. I was young enough that I wasn't sure it was my place to ask, and old enough to know that 3 seasons on the water had earned me some standing to be direct. He looked at me for a moment before answering, the specific look of a person deciding what version of an answer to give, and then he said, "Anomalous return. Shows up sometimes out here. You'll see it again." He said it in a tone that was not quite dismissive, but that was clearly not inviting further discussion, and I filed it away as one of those pieces of information that experienced fishermen dispense in incomplete form and expect you to accumulate context around over time. I saw it again, not that season, but in subsequent seasons in those waters, and the anomalous return that showed up on radar in the Bering Sea in conditions that shouldn't produce it became one of the first data points in a collection I've been building for 19 more years. I'll describe the anomalous return precisely, because precision matters, and because I've heard other fishermen describe it imprecisely in ways that make it sound like ordinary radar artifact, which it is not. What shows up on the display is a return that is large, not enormous, but large, comparable in radar cross-section to a vessel of significant size, that moves in ways that no vessel moves, including at speeds that no surface vessel achieves and at depths that surface vessels don't occupy. It appears and it moves and it disappears, and it does not behave like weather return, which I've also seen extensively and which has entirely different characteristics. It does not behave like a school of fish, which shows up as a dispersed, low-intensity cloud rather than a compact, high-intensity return. It does not behave like the occasional submarine contact that commercial fishermen in those waters see from time to time, which has its own characteristics and which the Navy, when you call it in, usually acknowledges with a brevity that suggests they'd prefer you hadn't mentioned it. Over 22 years I've seen this return on 4 different vessels, in 3 different bodies of water, the Bering Sea, the Gulf of Alaska, and in a section of the Pacific coast well south of Alaska that I'm not going to specify more precisely. It is not the same object. I cannot say that 4 radar returns across 22 years in 3 different bodies of water represent the same thing. What I can say is that they share characteristics that distinguish them from every other category of radar return I've encountered in a career where reading a radar display is as fundamental to doing the job as reading the weather. I brought the anomalous return up with Halverson one more time, 2 seasons after his first answer, during a long overnight watch where he and I were the only 2 awake on a relatively quiet night passage. I'd had another return that season, on a different vessel, and I'd spent several months thinking about what he'd said the first time and what he hadn't said, and I thought I'd developed enough context to ask a better question. I told him I'd seen the same kind of return on another vessel in different waters, and asked him what he actually thought it was. He was quiet for a long time, the kind of quiet that has weight to it, that isn't deciding what to say, but is deciding whether to say anything at all. And then he said, "There are things in the deep water that nobody's put a name to yet." The old-timers talked about it. Natives along the coast have been talking about it for longer than the fisheries existed. I've seen things from this boat that I can't explain and that I don't talk about, because talking about it makes you the guy who talks about it, and then your crew doesn't sleep right and your insurance rates go up. But it's real. Whatever it is, it's real. He said it quietly and calmly, and without any apparent desire for me to respond, and I didn't respond immediately, and after a moment he changed the subject to the weather system coming in from the northwest, and we talked about that for the rest of the watch. That was the most direct I ever heard Halverson be about it. He died 6 years ago, a heart attack on land, not on the water, which I think would have disappointed him. He was a good captain and a fair man, and whatever he'd seen in those waters over 20 years of working them, he carried it with the same steady professionalism he brought to everything else about the job. I want to be clear about something before I go further. What I'm describing in this account is not primarily about radar anomalies and not primarily about things in deep water, though those are real, and though I'll come back to both of them. The core of what I need to tell you is about what I've seen along the shore, in the nearshore waters, and on the beaches and rocky coasts of the islands and the mainland in the remote sections of the Alaskan coast that the fishing industry takes you to and that most people never see. Because that's where the encounters happen that have no radar explanation and no anomalous return language that keeps them at a safe professional distance. That's where I've seen things that required me, after the fact, to make decisions about what to say and what not to say to my crew, and to my family, and to the maritime authorities, and to myself. Things on the shore at night. Things in the water close to the vessel. Things that I have never found in any field guide or any maritime folklore collection or any database of known marine life, and that I have found described, in the specific, careful language of people who aren't prone to exaggeration, in conversations with other longtime fishermen who've worked those same waters and who arrived at the same decision I arrived at, which is that there are things in Alaska's remote coastal waters that the world doesn't have a name for, and that the people who encounter them have two choices: tell someone or don't. Most people don't. I'm going to. The second incident, the first on shore, happened in my 5th season. I was working a salmon tinder operation out of a small cannery on an island in the Kodiak archipelago, a stationary assignment rather than open water fishing, which means you spend a lot of time tied up at a dock or at anchor in protected water, waiting for the salmon boats to come in with their catch. The island was not inhabited year-round by anyone except the cannery crew during the season, maybe 25 people at peak, and the surrounding coastline was as remote as any I'd worked. Dense spruce forest coming right to the water's edge in most places, occasional gravel beaches. The specific quality of wilderness coast that exists only when you're so far from any road that even the notion of a road feels abstract. I had night anchor watch from midnight to 4, which meant 3 hours and change of sitting on the stern of the tender in a protected cove, watching the anchor light, monitoring the weather and the tide, and otherwise being present in case anything happened that required a response. The cove was well protected and the night was calm, maybe 5 to 8 knots of wind from the southwest, and the water nearly flat in the protected water behind the island's headland. No moon, but a clear sky with extraordinary star visibility that those latitudes produce when the clouds clear, the kind of sky that has depth to it. At roughly 1:30, a sound started from the shoreline about 250 meters off our port side, in the spruce timber above the beach. I say started because it didn't begin suddenly. It came up gradually, the way a sound comes up when its source is moving from further away to closer, a slow build over maybe a minute before it was fully present and clearly audible from the boat. I have spent 22 years working Alaska, which means I've heard brown bear, which makes a wide range of vocalizations in a wide range of pitches, none of which sounds like this. I've heard the deep sea calls of humpback whales in conditions where the sound carries through the hull and through the water at close range. I've heard sea lions, which can be very loud and which produce sounds that, in the dark, can initially be disconcerting. I've heard the sounds that dense spruce forest produces in variable wind, which can create low moaning frequencies that travel across water. I've heard all of these things many times, in many conditions, and I have calibrated references for all of them. What I heard from the timber above that beach did not fit any of those references. It was rhythmic, which was the first thing. A repeating, low-frequency pulse with a period of roughly 8 to 10 seconds between pulses, long enough to make you think it had stopped, short enough that when the next pulse came you understood it was a deliberate interval rather than the end of the sound. Each pulse lasted 2 to 3 seconds. The pitch was below most of what human speech occupies, but above what whale song occupies, in a register that I don't have a good comparison for, a sound that you felt through the hull and through your sternum at the same time you heard it with your ears. It continued for close to 25 minutes, during which time I made no radio contact, woke no one, and stayed exactly where I was on the stern, because what I was hearing was producing in me a response that I want to describe as carefully as I can. It wasn't fear. I've been afraid on the water in conditions that genuinely warranted fear, and I know what that feels like. What I felt during those 25 minutes was something closer to the suspended, pressurized state that certain kinds of extreme focus produce, a state where everything that isn't directly relevant to the immediate situation is removed, and the immediate situation is processed with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable. Every pulse of that sound was registered completely. My mind was not wandering. I was not tired despite it being 1:30 in the morning after a long working day. I was entirely present in a way that felt enforced rather than chosen. When it stopped as gradually as it had started, fading over the course of maybe a minute, exactly the reverse of its arrival, which meant it was moving away rather than simply stopping. And when it was gone, the cove was exactly the same as it had been before. Flat calm water, star-heavy sky, anchor light reflecting off the surface. Nothing visible anywhere that would explain what I'd heard. I've thought about why I didn't call it in. It was my first night watch on that assignment, and I was the newest crew member on that tender. And there's a specific social dynamic on fishing vessels that rewards competence and composure and penalizes reports that can't be followed up with something concrete. Because concrete action is what the job runs on, and anomalous sound in remote Alaska in the middle of the night is not something you can take concrete action on. I also want to be honest. Something about that sound had produced in me a very strong instinct not to draw attention to myself while it was happening, not to make noise, not to key the radio, not to go below and wake anyone. I don't know the right name for that instinct. It may have been nothing. It may have been exactly what it felt like, which was the instinct of a creature that understood, without articulating it, that it was in the presence of something for which low visibility was the correct posture. I said nothing that night. I finished my watch, went below, slept for 3 hours, and came up for the morning work. I mentioned it to no one for 3 days, and then mentioned it obliquely to the oldest member of the cannery crew, a man who'd worked that island for close to 15 seasons and who had the quality that very long-tenured people in isolated operations develop, a settled, encyclopedic familiarity with the specific place that makes newcomers' questions feel genuinely interesting rather than tedious. I described the sound as carefully as I could. He listened carefully and without any visible reaction, and when I'd finished he said, "Which cove were you anchored in?" I told him. He nodded, slowly, and said, "Yeah, every few years." Doesn't always happen, but it happens. He said it in exactly the tone you'd use for a fact about the equipment or the weather, something known and categorized and worked around without drama. He started to say something else, stopped, and then said, "It doesn't bother anything. The bears know about it. You notice, the bears don't come down to that beach at night. Anything lives on this island long enough figures out where it doesn't go after dark." He walked away after that and didn't come back to the subject, and I was left with the specific, uncomfortable gift that experienced people in remote places sometimes give you, which is a piece of local knowledge that answers your immediate question while opening up a space behind it that's considerably larger and darker than anything you went in asking about. I've been back to that island 3 times since. The first time, in my 12th season, I anchored in that same cove on purpose, deliberately, to see if the sound recurred. It didn't. I lay awake until 3 in the morning and then gave up and slept. The second time, in my 15th season, I anchored in a different cove at a different approach, and the sound started at about 2 in the morning from the timber above the beach, and I lay in my bunk and listened to it for 40 minutes, and then it faded and I went to sleep. The third time, last season, I was there for a week of repair work at the cannery dock, and the sound came twice, both times between 1 and 2 in the morning, both times from the same general section of timber above the same stretch of beach, and by then I had 19 years of accumulated experience with this and other things. And I lay in my bunk and listened and noted the duration and the approximate intensity, and went to sleep when it stopped, the way you sleep in a house with a noise you've learned to live with. What I have not done in 3 return visits is gone ashore at night toward the timber above that beach. I've hiked that coast in daylight many times and found nothing unusual. Whatever produces that sound produces it after dark, from the timber, in a specific location that I could probably identify within a few hundred meters, and I have made a decision that going to that location in daylight looking for a source would not produce anything useful, and going there at night to listen from closer range would be a decision I could not justify professionally, and that's some part of me, not the rational part. Objects to with a clarity that I've learned to take seriously. The third incident is the one that changed everything. I want to build toward it properly, because it requires context that I've been providing, and because understanding what happened in year 11 of my career requires understanding the accumulated weight of what preceded it. But before I get there, I want to describe something that happened in year 8 that I've told only 3 people, because it is the hardest thing in this account to say out loud without losing the credibility. I need to get the rest of it heard. In my 8th season, I was running deck on a 60-foot salmon tender working a remote stretch of coast on the Alaska Peninsula, an area of the coast that is genuinely one of the most isolated places in the United States. Accessible primarily by float plane and visited primarily by the commercial fishery and by the brown bear hunters who pay significant amounts of money to be flown into the coastal meadows and river systems. We were working a set of anchor points along a section of coastline that had good salmon aggregations, spending several days at each anchorage, waiting for the seiners and gillnetters to bring in their catch. On the third night at one of these anchorages, I was on the stern watching the water in the way that becomes habitual after years of anchor watch, not actively looking for anything, but with the kind of unfocused, peripheral attention that catches things the direct gaze misses. The water in the anchorage was calm, and the sky had a low overcast that diffused enough light to give me decent visibility to maybe 30 or 40 meters in the immediate vicinity of the vessel. Something surfaced about 15 meters off the port stern. I need to describe this carefully. I've seen everything that regularly surfaces in Alaskan waters, including everything you'd expect and several things that were genuinely unusual. A sperm whale in nearshore water that it had no business occupying, a walrus several hundred miles outside its normal range, a Greenland shark, which is one of the most unusual things I've seen in the water in 22 years. I've seen all of these things, and I know how each of them surfaces and what each of them looks like when it's at the surface and what happens to the water around them. What came to the surface 15 meters off my port stern did so slowly, over the course of maybe 30 to 40 seconds, and what broke the water was not a head and not a dorsal fin and not a fluking tail. What broke the surface was a section of back or dorsal surface. I use the word dorsal loosely because I'm not confident the anatomy of what I'm describing maps cleanly onto fish or cetacean terminology that was dark, smooth, and large. Not large in the way that a humpback whale is large, which is to say unambiguously enormous and unmistakable. Large in the way that something considerably bigger than a harbor seal and considerably smaller than a gray whale is large, but with a shape and a surface texture and a movement in the water that didn't match either of those or anything between them. It was at the surface for close to a minute. In that minute it moved, very slowly, parallel to the vessel, maintaining roughly the same distance, and the section of back or dorsal surface that was visible didn't rise and fall the way cetacean breathing produces a rise and fall. There was no blow, no exhalation, no behavioral context for the surfacing that I could read. It simply moved slowly parallel, visible as a dark shape in the water in a way that let me track it without ever giving me a clear enough look to put a confident identification on it. Then it went below. Not a dive, not the fluking sound and water displacement of a whale sounding, not the quick, rolling departure of a porpoise or a seal. It went below the way something goes below when it is choosing to submerge rather than reacting to a stimulus, slowly, in control of its own buoyancy, disappearing over the course of the same 30 to 40 seconds it had taken to appear. I stood at the stern for a long time after that. When I went below and turned on the light over my bunk, I found that my hands were not entirely steady, which surprised me, because the experience itself had not produced what I would have called active fear. Something else. Something more like the cognitive overload that happens when your pattern recognition systems are running full speed and not finding a match, a processing demand that has a physical correlate in the body. I knew what I'd seen was real. I didn't know what I'd seen. Those two facts were in direct conflict in a way that had a physical cost. I've described this in broad terms to perhaps 8 people in 14 years, always carefully, always factually, and the responses have divided cleanly into 3 categories. People who think I saw a known species I failed to identify for some reason, people who think I'm exaggerating or confabulating, and a small number of people, other long-tenured fishermen primarily, who go very still when I describe it and ask very precise questions about the surface texture and the movement pattern, and who, after I've answered those questions, tell me their own version of the same account from their own waters in their own seasons. The last group is the most informative, and I've collected their accounts the way I've collected everything else. Carefully, privately, in a part of my professional knowledge that doesn't make it into any official document. Now I want to tell you about year 11. I was captain of a 68-foot tender that season, my first year running my own vessel, which meant the decisions were mine and the responsibility was mine, and what happened on my watch was my account to answer for. We were working a section of coast in the far western part of the Alaska Peninsula, genuinely remote water, the kind of coastline that has no road access for hundreds of miles in any direction, where the nearest thing to a town is a small native village 2 hours by skiff, where the satellite phone worked sometimes and the VHF radio worked mostly, and you were, in a functional sense, operating at the outer edge of the infrastructure that makes modern commercial work in Alaska possible. My crew that season was 3, a deck boss named Marcus with 8 years of Alaska experience, a deckhand named Pete in his 4th season, and a cook engineer named Anna who was in her 2nd year with me on that vessel, and who had the kind of mechanical aptitude and comm competence that makes an engineer worth more than their formal role description suggests. For people total, on a vessel that size, in those waters, for people is a tight crew and everyone knows their job and does it. We were working a set of anchor points north of a headland that I've been to several times since and that I'll refer to here as the North Anchorage, because naming it specifically is not something I'm willing to do in this account for reasons that relate to the events I'm about to describe. The North Anchorage was a protected bay about a mile across, good holding ground for anchor, tree line visible on 3 sides, with a small gravel beach on the eastern shore that brown bears worked regularly for the salmon in the creek that drained into the bay. We'd anchored there several times that season without incident. On the 6th night at that anchorage, I was asleep in my bunk when Marcus knocked on the cabin door and told me in a very controlled, quiet voice that I needed to come to the wheelhouse. I've been woken for emergencies on fishing vessels enough times to know the difference between emergency urgency and something is wrong urgency, and what Marcus communicated through the door was the second kind, which in some ways is worse because it doesn't come with the adrenaline clarity that genuine emergency produces. I came to the wheelhouse. Marcus was at the port window looking out at the bay, and Pete was standing slightly behind him, and neither of them were saying anything. I came to the window and looked. On the beach on the eastern shore, close to where the creek came out, there was a figure. At the range, roughly 3/4 of a mile, it was not possible to resolve fine detail, but several things were immediately apparent. It was tall, very tall, significantly taller than a person when I sized it against the tree line behind the beach. It was upright. It was standing still. And it was doing something that neither a person nor any animal I know does, which was reflecting light, not in the way that eyes reflect light in a spotlight, but in a broader, more diffuse way, as though the surface of it was doing something with the ambient light of the overcast night sky that normal surfaces don't do. It wasn't glowing. Nothing about it was luminescent or supernatural in any visual sense I can describe. It was more that in a scene where everything was dark in the expected proportions for that kind of overcast night, the figure at the beach was slightly, inexplicably lighter than its surroundings, in a way that made it visible at a range that nothing else in the scene was visible. Marcus said, quietly, "I've been watching it for about 20 minutes. It hasn't moved." I watched it. He was right. In the time I stood at that window, close to 15 minutes, it did not move. It stood at the edge of the creek outflow and the tidal flat, and it was still with the totality of stillness that I've noted before, in the spotlight incident in a different context, the stillness of something that is not making an effort to be still, because stillness is its default state. Pete said, "What is it?" I said I didn't know. This was the first time in 11 seasons of this work that I'd answered a question from a crew member about something I was looking at with "I don't know" and meant it completely, without the qualification that I was sure there was a reasonable explanation I hadn't identified yet. I didn't have that qualification available. I was looking at something I didn't have a category for, and I was the captain, and my crew was looking at the same thing, and what happened next was my decision to make. I made it. I told them both to go below, go to their bunks, and stay there until morning. I told them we were going to monitor the situation through the night and assess in daylight, and that there was nothing to be done right now, and they should sleep if they could. Marcus looked at me for a moment with the particular look of an experienced fisherman who knows his captain has made a decision and who doesn't entirely agree with it, but who is going to honor the hierarchy because the hierarchy is what keeps a vessel running. He went below. Pete went below. Anna, who'd slept through everything, stayed below. I stayed in the wheelhouse for the next 3 hours. The figure on the beach did not move for the first 2 hours. It stood exactly where it had been standing when Marcus had first noticed it, and it remained as I've described, still, slightly lighter than its surroundings, at the edge of the creek outflow, facing the water and therefore facing the vessel. In the second hour, I began to become aware that something else was happening that I hadn't initially registered, which was that the water in the bay was behaving unusually. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have signaled anything on its own. The surface of the bay was calm, as it had been, but there was a pattern to the calm that wasn't right, a stillness that extended beyond what the weather conditions explained. No small chop, no surface ripple from the wind that was still moving at 5 to 8 knots, the surface so flat that the stars were reflected in it despite conditions that shouldn't have allowed that level of specular reflection. The water was being held flat. That's the only way I can describe it. Something was exerting a calming effect on the water surface in that bay that the wind should have prevented, and the flatness of the surface had a quality to it that I have never encountered before or since, a flatness that felt deliberate rather than natural, the way the surface of a tank of water is flat, managed, and contained rather than simply settled. At the end of the second hour, the figure on the beach moved. It walked, and I use that word because it was bipedal and upright, and the movement was analogous to walking. Even if the analogy was imperfect, it walked along the beach in the direction of the tree line at the north end of the bay, moving without apparent urgency, and then it walked into the tree line and was gone. Not dramatically, not quickly. It simply walked into the trees, and the beach was empty. The water in the bay returned to normal within a few minutes of it going. The surface chop came back. The stars ceased to reflect. The bay was a bay again. I stayed in the wheelhouse until first light, about 4 hours later. Nothing else happened. In the morning, I went ashore with Marcus to check the creek and the beach. I told him I wanted to look at the bear sign near the creek mouth, which was true. We looked at the creek mouth. I walked the section of beach where the figure had been standing. There were bear tracks on the beach, multiple sets, overlapping. There was nothing else. No impression in the gravel that matched anything bipedal in the proportions I'd observed, no sign of passage at the tree line that would account for something of that apparent size moving into the timber. Marcus walked next to me for most of the beach inspection without speaking. When we were heading back to the skiff, he said, "That wasn't a bear." I said no. He said, "I've been up this coast 6 seasons. Third time I've seen something like that on a beach." Different beaches. Same thing. I said, "What do the other crews say when you tell them?" He said, "I don't tell them." We got in the skiff and went back to the vessel and went to work and didn't discuss it again that season. Marcus crewed for me for 3 more seasons after that before he went to work for a different operation, and in those 3 seasons we never directly discussed what we'd seen on that beach. What we did develop, without articulating it, was a working protocol. Certain anchorages, we anchored differently. At less exposed points in the bay, closer to the vessel's own tide swing limit, in positions that minimize the amount of shoreline directly visible from the main windows. It wasn't avoidance. It was adjustment. The professional accommodation to a feature of the operating environment, the same way you adjust your anchoring protocol for unusual current or unusual bottom composition. You know the thing. You work around it. You don't make it the center of the operation because the job is the center of the operation and the job has to get done. The thing at the North Anchorage beach was the most direct and sustained encounter I've had in 22 years, but it was not an isolated experience, and I want to be clear about that. In the years since, I've had 9 additional incidents that I'd place in the same general category. Things on beaches or in nearshore water in remote sections of the Alaskan coast that don't fit any category of known wildlife, and that share a recognizable family of characteristics. The scale, the stillness, the quality of presence that I keep trying to find the right word for, and that I'll settle on calling attention. A sense of directed, intelligent attention that comes from the direction of the thing and that feels, when you're on the receiving end of it, like something that understands it's being observed and has its own position on the matter. In addition to my own 9, I've collected accounts from other fishermen that now number in the mid-20s. Not anecdotes over a beer. Specific, detailed, careful accounts from professional fishermen with significant Alaska experience, given to me in contexts that invited honesty. Late watches, vessel-to-vessel communication in isolated anchorages, conversations with other captains at cannery docks in the off-season. These people are not given to casual exaggeration. Their livelihoods depend on accurate assessment of conditions and honest reporting of information, the same as mine. What they describe, when they describe the encounters that live outside their official reports, is consistent in its basic profile across different waters, different vessels, different seasons, different decades. Something large, something bipedal or near bipedal, something in or near the water of remote Alaskan coastline, watching. I need to tell you about the water itself before I close this account, because the water is part of the story that most people who live on land don't have a framework for. The Bering Sea is one of the most biologically productive bodies of water on Earth, and one of the least understood. The depths of the Bering, the abyssal sections in the middle of the basin, are in some places among the least surveyed stretches of ocean on the planet. Commercial fishermen work the continental shelf and the slope, not the deep basin, and even the shelf fisheries represent only a thin sampling of what the water column contains. The ocean at depth is a genuinely different world, with conditions, pressure, temperature, darkness, chemistry, that most life adapted to the surface would find immediately lethal, and that support forms of life that we have barely begun to understand. I've been in the commercial fishery long enough to know what oceanographers and fishery scientists know about what's in those waters, because the fishery intersects with science regularly, and I've talked to people who spend their careers studying the Bering Sea and the Gulf of Alaska. What I know from those conversations is that the deep water fauna of those basins is significantly underdescribed, that new species are documented every few years, that the size of organisms at depth continues to surprise researchers, and that the behavioral ecology of many species in those waters is essentially unknown because observation is so difficult in that environment. I'm not telling you that what I've encountered is a deep water species that surfaces occasionally in nearshore waters. I don't know what it is. What I am telling you is that the confidence with which some people dismiss unexplained encounters in Alaskan coastal waters, the certainty that anything that large would have been identified and documented by now, is a confidence that the actual state of oceanic science in those waters doesn't support. The Bering Sea is not the English Channel. It is not a body of water that has been surveyed comprehensively, in all seasons, at all depths, with adequate technology, over adequate time. It is a vast, cold, dark, biologically extraordinary body of water that the commercial fishery has been extracting value from for a century with tools that, relative to the actual complexity of the system, are very blunt. Whatever is in those waters, on those shores, watching from the beaches of the uninhabited coastlines of the Alaska Peninsula and the Aleutians and the waters further north and further west than I've worked, it has been seen by people who work the water for long enough to know what they're looking at, across a span of time that goes back, well before my 22 years and well before the commercial fishery's 100 years. The Alaska Native communities who've lived along those coasts for thousands of years have names for it. Different communities, different names, but names, categories that acknowledge the thing's existence as a feature of the coastal environment rather than an anomaly to be explained away. I've spoken to one Alaska Native fisherman, in my 17th year, who'd worked the water alongside the commercial fleet for his entire adult life, and who had the dual fluency in both the traditional knowledge of his community and the technical knowledge of the modern fishery that a lifetime of operating in both cultures produces. I described, carefully, the figure on the beach at the North Anchorage. He listened without expression and then said, in a flat, entirely unexcited tone, "Yeah. They're around. That was all. Yeah, they're around." Said the way you'd say it about halibut or about weather systems or about any other predictable, regular feature of the operating environment in those waters. Not surprising. Not frightening. Known. He'd grown up knowing. His parents had known and their parents had known. And the knowledge went back further than he could personally trace, attached to specific locations and specific conditions and specific seasons with the precision that traditional ecological knowledge develops when it's accumulated across generations of careful observation in the same environment. The thing I'd been encountering for 11 years of Alaska work and trying to find a category for was already in a category. It had a name. It had an associated body of knowledge about where it was found, and when, and under what conditions, and how to behave appropriately in its presence. The knowledge existed. It just existed in a repository that the commercial fishery and the maritime regulatory system and the fisheries science establishment didn't have easy access to, and hadn't particularly sought. I've been at sea for 22 years. I've been in weather that should have killed me and mechanical situations that came close and dangerous animal encounters that I'm not going to say more about because they're not the subject of this account. I've seen the ocean in every mood it has, from the flat, gray, terrifying calm of the Bering in the wrong conditions to the most beautiful water I've ever looked at in my life, which was a clear August day in a protected Kodiak Bay with the mountains behind it. A day so perfect that I thought about it for years afterward when I needed something good to hold on to. In 22 years, I've developed the deep, specific, practical love for that work and for those waters that long professional exposure to genuinely extraordinary places produces. I don't want to leave you with the impression that what I've described has made me afraid of the work or afraid of the water. It hasn't. I'm still out there. I'll be out there next season. What it has done is change how I understand the environment I work in, how I understand what shares that environment with me, and how I understand the limits of what any of the official, documented, institutional knowledge of those waters actually encompasses. The old-timers knew about it. The Alaska Native communities know about it, have always known about it, have names for it that predate the commercial fishery by millennia. The long-tenured fishermen who work the remote sections know about it, carry it in the specific, private, unofficial part of their professional knowledge that never makes it into a log or a report. And what they collectively know, and what I know from 22 years of paying careful attention in those waters, is this. The Alaskan coast is one of the last places on Earth where something genuinely large, genuinely unknown, and genuinely old exists in close proximity to human activity without the human activity being fully aware of it. It watches the vessels from the beaches of the uninhabited coastlines. It produces sounds from the timber above the remote anchorages that the local wildlife has calibrated its nighttime behavior around. It surfaces occasionally in nearshore water in ways that leave no adequate explanation for the observer. And it has been doing all of this for long enough that the cultures who've lived in closest relationship with those coasts have built it into their cosmology and their practical knowledge, the way you build any permanent, reliable feature of the environment into the way you understand the world. I don't know what to tell you to do with that. I don't know what I'm going to do with it beyond what I've been doing, which is going back out there every season, running my vessel as well as I know how, watching the water and the shore with the attention that 22 years of the work has trained me to bring, and noting what I see with the same honest precision I'd apply to any other feature of the operating environment. Whatever is on those beaches and in those waters has never damaged my vessel, never harmed my crew, never directly threatened any aspect of the commercial operation I'm responsible for. It watches. It produces its sounds. It surfaces and submerges. It exists at the edges of what the industry and the science and the regulatory framework can see, and it will continue to exist there long after the commercial fishery has come and gone and the equipment has rusted and the logbooks are lost and the last captain who worked those waters has come in from his last season and tied off his last line. The water is old. Whatever is in it is older. And if you work on the water long enough, in the right places, at the right hours, with the right quality of attention, it will let you know it's there. That's 22 years on the Alaskan coast. That's what I have to tell you. Be careful out there. There's a thing that happens to people who work remote Alaska for long enough that I want to describe, because it's the context in which everything else in this account needs to be understood. You develop a relationship with the emptiness that isn't like any relationship you can develop with land-based wilderness, even very remote land-based wilderness, because the emptiness here is three-dimensional. On land, the wilderness is to the sides of you and above you, and what's beneath you is solid and known and part of a geological system that is in principle comprehensible. On the water, and especially in the deep water of the Alaskan coast, the emptiness goes down as far as the land goes up and then further into conditions that no human being has ever visited without a pressure vessel, and that most of the ocean's own organisms have never visited either, because the pressure and the darkness and the cold of the abyssal zone are as hostile to almost everything alive as the surface of the moon. You float on the surface of something that is, beneath you, as unknown as anything on Earth. That knowledge changes the quality of the attention you pay. It also changes the quality of the silence. The Bering Sea in calm conditions, in remote water far from any other vessel, has a silence that is different from any silence I've experienced anywhere on land. Not the absence of sound. The water makes sounds. The hull makes sounds. Marine life produces sound that travels through the hull in ways that are entirely normal once you've heard enough of it. The silence I mean is something else, a quality of absence at the level of human presence. You are, on a vessel in remote Alaskan water, as far from any center of human activity as it's possible to be in the modern world and still be doing a legal commercial operation. The nearest other human being might be miles away on another vessel. The nearest building might be many miles behind you on a coastline that no road reaches. The nearest sound that a human being has made and that you're likely to hear, beyond the sounds of your own vessel, might be a distant radio transmission that might as well be from another world. In that silence, in that three-dimensional emptiness, your senses do something specific. They extend. They reach further, process more, deliver more to consciousness than they do in the ordinary sound-rich, visually busy environments that most people spend most of their lives in. You notice things that you would not otherwise notice. This is not imagination. It is sensory calibration, the same process by which a person who lives in a very quiet house develops the ability to hear sounds in it that visitors don't detect. Your nervous system adjusts to the signal-to-noise ratio of the environment, and in an environment with very low noise, the signal becomes extraordinarily clear. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that what I've reported in this account was not the product of darkness and isolation playing tricks on an understimulated mind. It was the product of a very well-calibrated sensory system operating in an environment where the calibration runs toward exceptional sensitivity, reporting, with great accuracy, what was actually there to be reported. The fifth incident I haven't described yet, I've been moving through the major ones and leaving some smaller ones behind, was an auditory incident in deep water during a transit between fishing grounds in the Bering Sea in my 13th season. I was at the helm on a night watch in conditions that were genuinely good, seas under 6 feet, visibility excellent, the kind of night where the work is almost pleasant. We were transiting in deep water, over the basin rather than the shelf, which was unusual for our operation, but was the routing that made sense for the weather window. At some point during the 3rd hour of my watch, a sound began that appeared to come from the water on the starboard side of the vessel. Not from the hull, not transmitted through the hull the way whale song is transmitted. This was external, arriving through the air above the water rather than through the metal of the hull. A low, very complex sound, below easy human pitch identification, that had structure to it in the way that music has structure. Not music, nothing that resembled music, but the quality of something that was organized by intention rather than produced randomly. It had a shape. It repeated with variations. It had duration and rhythm that were not the product of any environmental process I could identify. I've read about the sounds that the deep ocean produces, the biological acoustic environment that instruments have been measuring for decades, and I want to be clear that what I'm describing is not the ordinary acoustic environment of the deep ocean, which I've read about in enough detail to make that comparison meaningfully. This was not the clicking of sperm whales, not the song of humpbacks, not the low-frequency acoustic environment of any species I've found described in any marine mammal reference. It was something else, and it came from the water to my starboard side, close to the surface rather than from depth, and it lasted for close to an hour before fading gradually into the background noise of the vessel. I wrote it in my personal log that night, the way I've been writing things in my personal log for 22 years, not the official vessel log, not anything that goes to the owner or the fleet coordinator or any regulatory body, but the log I keep for myself. The one that has everything I've described in this account written in it in the language of a working professional who is trying to document something accurately and who doesn't care, in the privacy of his own log, about whether the documentation will embarrass him. That log is the source for much of what I've told you here. Without it, some of the details I've given you, the duration of the sound at the North Anchorage, the timing of the radar anomaly in year 3, the specific distance of the figure on the beach from the vessel, would have been approximate rather than precise. The fact that I've been keeping that log tells you something about how early in my career I understood that what I was encountering needed to be documented rather than allowed to fade. I started the personal log in year 5, the year of the cove anchorage and the sound from the timber. I didn't know at the time that I was beginning a systematic account. I was just a 30-year-old deckhand who had heard something in the timber above a remote Alaskan beach and needed to put it somewhere, and the log was where I put it. By year 13, when the transit sound happened, I'd been keeping the log for 8 years and had filled 2 of them, and the account they contained was already detailed enough to show me patterns that I might not have recognized without the written record. The sounds cluster by season in specific waters. The visual encounters on beaches cluster in specific locations. The radar anomalies occur in specific weather conditions. These are not random events distributed evenly across 22 years of exposure to Alaskan coastal waters. They have a structure, and that structure is the same kind of structure that predicts the behavior of any organism with a consistent ecology, the kind of structure that says this thing has a range, a season, a habitat preference, a behavior pattern that repeats because it's driven by the same ecological pressures that drive every other organism's behavior. I'm going to describe the night at the North Anchorage in more detail than I gave you before, because I held back some of what happened, and I want to give it to you in full. When Marcus came to get me, and I came to the wheelhouse and looked out at the beach, the figure was already there. But I didn't mention that something else was also happening that I noticed within the first few minutes of watching. The anchor chain was moving. Not because the vessel was swinging, which it wasn't. Conditions were calm, and we weren't swinging on the anchor. The chain was moving because the water at the bow, where the chain entered the water, was moving. Something was moving the water at the bow of the vessel in a way that caused the chain to shift. I didn't say this to Marcus or to Pete. I watched it for close to 10 minutes, the slow, periodic movement of the chain, and I reconciled it with the quality of the base surface I've already described, the unusual flatness, the specular reflection, and I came to a conclusion that I sat with for the rest of that night and that I've been sitting with ever since. Whatever was on the beach was not alone. There was something in the water of that bay as well, something that was moving through water held near flat in a way that caused a displacement effect near my anchor chain. Two of them, one on the beach and one in the water of the bay, and my vessel between them. I don't know if they were the same species. I don't know if they were communicating. I don't know if the flatness of the water was a natural condition they produced, or a condition they required, or a coincidence. What I know is that I spent 3 hours in the wheelhouse of my own vessel, alone, between something on the beach and something in the water of the bay, and that neither of those things moved toward the vessel at any point in those 3 hours, and that in the morning the beach was empty, and the water was an ordinary bay, and the world was a bay at first light the way it always is in Alaska at first light, flat gray and cold and beautiful and indifferent. I didn't tell Marcus about the anchor chain. I've told you, because you're not on that vessel with me, and the information can't change what you do about a situation that has long since resolved. But there are things you tell your crew and things you don't, and at 3 in the morning with 2 experienced fishermen below, who I'd sent to their bunks specifically to prevent them from spending the night in the wheelhouse watching what I was watching, adding to the picture was not what the moment called for. What I'll tell you instead is what I felt during those 3 hours. Not fear. What I felt was the very old, very clear sensation of being at an edge. Not a physical edge, though the vessel rail was the literal edge of the world I controlled, and the bay beyond it was the world I didn't control. A larger edge, a conceptual edge, the edge of what I understood about the world I'd been working in for 11 years. The edge of the category system I'd been using to make sense of everything I'd encountered, which had been working less and less well with each encounter, and which on that particular night, in that particular bay, with the chain moving at the bow and the figure on the beach and the water held flat in a way that the wind shouldn't have allowed, stopped working entirely. I crossed that edge sometime in the second hour, sitting in the wheelhouse in the dark, watching the beach. On one side of it was the understanding of the world that I'd built across 11 years of professional experience and a life before that. The understanding that the Alaskan coast was extraordinary but comprehensible, that the things in those waters were unknown in some respects, but knowable, that the horizon of the unknown was retreating in the way it always retreats as science and observation advance. On the other side of it was what I was actually looking at through the wheelhouse window, a thing on a beach, watching my vessel, in a bay where the water was flat in a way it shouldn't have been because something was in the water too. The other side of that edge was the understanding that the horizon of the unknown in those waters was not retreating. That in the dark, at the remote end of the continental shelf, in the waters of Alaska that the commercial fishery and the maritime science and the regulatory system have been working for 100 years, there was something that none of those systems had adequately reckoned with, that had been there for the entire 100 years and for thousands of years before that, and that would be there for however long the coast remained. I'm not a person who uses language like that easily. I'm a working fisherman. My professional life is organized around practical knowledge, observable conditions, mechanical systems, biological populations that are measured and monitored and managed. I don't naturally reach for language about the limits of human understanding. I reach for it here because it's accurate, and because accuracy is the commitment I'm making in this account. The Alaska native fisherman who told me, yeah, they're around. I want to come back to him, because he said something else in that same conversation that I didn't include before, something that I've thought about more than almost anything else from 22 years of encounters and conversations. I asked him, after he said, yeah, they're around, whether his community was afraid of them. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone who is genuinely considering how to translate between two very different frameworks for the same information, and then he said, afraid is the wrong question. The question is respect. You respect them the way you respect the weather. The weather will kill you if you're stupid about it. They won't bother you if you're not stupid about it. Different kind of respect from the same idea. He said it matter-of-factly, the same tone he used for everything else. Not mystical, not performed, not an invitation to explore the topic further. A practical statement about a practical relationship with a feature of the environment. Respect what's larger than you. Don't be stupid about it. Go home at the end of the season. I've operated by that framework for the last several years, more consciously than before that conversation, and I can tell you that it has served me well. I've had encounters since then, as I've said, 9 additional ones after the North Anchorage. In none of those 9 have I felt directly threatened. In none of them have I done anything that a sensible person operating by the respect framework would call stupid. I've watched what was there to watch. I've noted what was there to note. I've gone back to my log and written it down accurately. And I've come home at the end of every season. The water is not going to kill me because of what's in it. That's not why the water kills people, though the water has many other reasons to kill people and pursues them diligently. What's in those remote coastal waters has been coexisting with human activity in Alaska for longer than anyone alive can remember, and the coexistence has, as far as I can determine from the accounts of every fisherman and hunter and guide and Alaska Native community member I've spoken with who has relevant experience, been managed through some version of the same framework. Know it's there. Give it the respect that any large, powerful, unknown thing deserves, and don't go looking for it in places and at hours that looking is not wise. I'm going to give you the practical version of that last part, because this account has been running long and I want to end it with something useful rather than just something unsettling. If you fish in Alaska, or guide in Alaska, or work on the water along that coast in any capacity, what you've heard about the remote anchorages being places where strange things happen is not exaggeration. The specific waters where encounter probability is highest are not the waters near the towns and the canneries and the active commercial zones. They're the remote sections, the overnight anchorages far from any other vessel, the beaches of the uninhabited islands, and the uninhabited stretches of the mainland coast where the only human presence is your vessel at anchor. In those anchorages, what you see and hear in the middle of the night deserves the same respect the fisherman described. Note it, don't be stupid about it. Stay on your vessel if you don't have a compelling professional reason to leave it. The sounds from the timber are not going to hurt you. The figure on the beach is not going to swim to your vessel. The thing moving in the water of the bay is not going to damage your hull. In all the accounts I've collected across 22 years, in every conversation I've had with every long-tenured fisherman willing to speak honestly about what they've encountered in those waters, in all of it, the encounters have never turned violent, never resulted in injury, never escalated beyond watching and sounds. What it does is know you're there, and it lets you know it knows. And that, if you're paying attention, is enough to communicate everything you need to understand about what kind of world you're working in. You're not at the top of anything out there. Not on the water, not on those remote shores, not in those remote anchorages in the dark. Whatever is in those waters was there before the fishery, and it will be there after, and it has never needed to make itself known to the commercial operators and the maritime regulatory system and the fisheries scientists to go about the business of existing in its own environment for as long as it's been existing there. It has never needed acknowledgement. It has never applied for it. It has the ocean, and the ocean is its home, and it is at home in a way that 22 years of professional Alaska fishery work has given me only a very modest version of, and it will be at home in those waters long after the last vessel I ever captained has been hauled out and scrapped. I've been grateful for 22 years in those waters, even for this. Especially for this. Maybe because the thing that working at the edge of the world's last big wilderness gives you, if you're paying attention, is a very clear and very honest picture of what the world actually is, rather than what the world presents itself as in the places where human management of the environment has made it comfortable and comprehensible and apparently complete. The world is not complete. There are large, important things in it that don't have names in any of the systems we've built to understand the world. Those things are real, and they are old, and they are in their environments the way you are in your life, going about the work of their existence with no particular regard for whether that existence fits into any category you've been given to work with. That's what I know. That's what 22 years on the Alaskan coast gave me. Take it home with you. I want to go back and fill in some of the incidents I've summarized, because the count of 9 additional encounters after the North Anchorage is too sparse a description of what those years actually contained, and the specific details of several of those encounters are relevant to the larger picture I'm trying to give you. In year 14, 2 years after the North Anchorage, I was running my vessel through a section of coast I'd worked before, heading south along the outside of one of the island groups in the Kodiak archipelago, in calm conditions in late August. This is one of the most beautiful coastal environments I know, green islands rising out of flat gray water, massive sea cliffs, the kind of coastal scenery that stops your breath even after you've seen it dozens of times. We were transiting in the afternoon, making good time toward the next anchorage, when my engineer Anna came to the bridge and said there was something in the water off the starboard side. I looked. We were perhaps half a mile off a sea cliff section, the base of the cliff in the water, no beach, just vertical rock going into the sea. In the water at the base of the cliff, roughly 200 meters off our beam, there was something in the kelp zone that didn't match the seal population I'd been monitoring from the bridge for the last several miles. What I want to say carefully is that the Kodiak Island waters have very healthy harbor seal populations, and I've seen them hauled out on rocks and swimming in kelp beds thousands of times, and what we were looking at wasn't that. The scale was wrong. The way it was moving through the surface kelp was wrong. The proportion of what was visible to what was presumably below the surface didn't match the profile of a seal at the surface, where seals are mostly buoyant and visible. Anna stood next to me with binoculars for several minutes. She's an experienced offshore engineer, not a natural history observer, but she's been on Alaskan waters for 8 years, and she knows what the common marine mammals look like in those waters. She lowered the binoculars and said, without any particular drama, "That's not a sea lion." It wasn't. Whatever was moving through the kelp at the base of that sea cliff was considerably larger than a stellar sea lion, which are the largest pinniped in those waters, and it was moving in a way that didn't match any pinniped behavior I've observed. It moved through the kelp belt parallel to the cliff face, covering ground at a steady pace, without the surface breaks and resubmersions that characterize marine mammal movement through kelp. After perhaps 5 minutes of following our vessel's apparent position, it went below, and the kelp returned to its ordinary motion. Anna looked at me. I looked at her. She said, "Do we report that?" I said, "What would we report?" She was quiet for a moment. Unknown large marine animal moving through kelp at the base of the sea cliff, not matching any known species in the region. I said, "Have you ever called in a report like that?" She said she hadn't. I said, "Neither have I, and I've been out here 14 years. And I looked at her, and I let that sit there, because what I was saying without saying it was that there was a reason neither of us had ever called in a report like that, and the reason wasn't that we'd never had the experience. The reason was that the framework for making that call, the channel through which a report of an unidentified large marine animal gets taken seriously, evaluated, followed up on, added to a database, and used to inform any kind of policy or management decision doesn't really exist in any form that makes the call productive. The National Marine Fisheries Service takes reports of marine mammal entanglement and strike and stranding. The Coast Guard takes reports of hazards to navigation. The Alaska Department of Fish and Game takes reports that relate to the fishery. None of them have a category that cleanly receives what we were looking at, and the absence of a category is the mechanism by which this kind of information disappears from the official record without any active decision to suppress it. There is nowhere useful to put it, and so it goes in the personal log and stays there. In year 17, I had an experience on a remote beach that was different from any of the others in a specific way that I haven't experienced before or since. I was doing a shore walk in the afternoon at an anchorage on the Alaska Peninsula, a walk I took specifically to stretch my legs and to check the creek mouth for bear sign, an ordinary piece of situational awareness I always do when I'm anchored near bear habitat. I'd been walking the beach for about 20 minutes when I found tracks. Tracks in beach gravel are never as clear as tracks in soft mud or snow, because gravel deforms and then springs back, and the impression is vague and quickly erased by the next tide. These were in a section of the beach where a thin band of wet sand above the tide line had preserved them clearly. I saw them from about 10 feet away as I came around a slight bend in the beach, and I stopped when I saw them. The way you stop when you see something on the ground that your pattern recognition has flagged before your conscious mind has caught up. I looked at them for a long time before I moved closer. They were large, larger than bear, which was my immediate comparison because bear tracks in beach sand in that part of Alaska are common, and I've seen hundreds of them. The wrong shape for bear, as well. The toe arrangement and the heel profile were different in ways I noted carefully before I crouched to examine them more closely. Bipedal, as near as I could determine from the section of beach preserved in the wet sand, and the stride length between the two visible complete impressions was close to 5 feet, which on a flat, wet beach represents a walking pace rather than a running one. I photographed them. I measured them, with my own boot for scale and with a tape measure from my survival kit. 18 inches long, 7 inches wide at the forefoot. The impressions were pressed deep enough into the wet sand to indicate significant weight, considerably more than my own mass in a dry suit and deck boots. The tide line where the impressions were was about 45 minutes from the high tide mark by my estimate, which meant these tracks were no more than 3 or 4 hours old. Something had walked this beach in the last 3 or 4 hours on 2 feet, in the direction away from the creek mouth and toward the point at the far end of the beach, and whatever it was did not match any category I had. I stood up and looked toward the point. The beach curved, and I couldn't see all the way to the point from where I was standing, and the timber above the beach on that side of the bay came right to the gravel in places, with heavy undergrowth between the trees. I thought about following the track line toward the point. I thought about it for several minutes, standing on that beach in the afternoon sun, which was warm and flat and entirely ordinary, in a landscape that in the afternoon light looked almost gentle by the standards of the Alaska Peninsula, which doesn't do gentle as a rule. I did not follow the track line toward the point. I went back to the vessel. I've second-guessed that decision a few times over the years. Not in a way that makes me think I made the wrong call. I didn't, and I don't believe I would have found anything useful, and I believe I might have found something I wasn't prepared for and didn't have the context or the equipment or the backup to respond to appropriately. What I second-guess is the window it represented, a clear, daylight sighting of physical evidence that was fresh enough to follow and precise enough to document, and the decision to document what I had and walk away from the chance to get more. I second-guess it not because I think I should have done differently, but because I'm aware of how rare it is to have the conditions align for that kind of close, fresh, clear documentation, and I know that the opportunity may not come again. The photographs are in my files. I've had them looked at by a wildlife biologist, by a physical anthropologist at a university who agreed to take a look informally, and by 2 experienced hunters who know the large mammal tracts of that part of Alaska as well as anyone. The biologist couldn't identify them. The physical anthropologist said the 4-foot structure wasn't consistent with any hominid in the fossil record or current population, and she said it with the careful, non-committal precision of someone who is giving you their honest professional assessment of something they don't want to be associated with in any official capacity. The hunters said they'd never seen tracks like that, and one of them went quiet in a way that told me he might have something to add but had decided not to. That's where the track photographs live, in my files, with the opinions of 4 people who've looked at them and the unanimous assessment of 3 out of 4 that they don't match anything known, and the 4th, the hunters, without a stated opinion at all. I've told you about 22 years of this work. I've told you about the anomalous radar, the sounds in the timber, the figure on the beach, and the thing in the water of the bay on the same night, the transit sound in deep water, the kelp bed encounter, the tracks on the beach. I've told you about Halverson's confirmation and the cannery man's matter-of-fact acknowledgement and the Alaska native fisherman's entirely unexcited "yeah, they're around." I've given you the best account I can of a career's worth of encounters in some of the most remote and least surveyed coastal waters on the surface of this planet. What I haven't given you yet is the thing that ties it together in my own mind, the observation that makes the pattern make sense in a way that lets me carry it without it being an unresolved anxiety rather than a piece of knowledge. I want to give you that, because I think it changes what this account means. In year 19, 3 years ago, I was in a small boat harbor on the Kenai Peninsula, running maintenance on my vessel in the off-season, when I fell into conversation with an older fisherman who'd been working Alaska waters since before I was born, close to 40 years total, and who had the specific, compressed quality of knowledge that 40 years of careful observation in a specific environment produces. We were talking about the waters generally, about how the fishery had changed over his career, about areas of the coast he'd worked and areas he'd avoided, and at some point the conversation moved into the territory that I've described in this account, as conversations with long-tenured Alaska fishermen sometimes do when the hour is late and the setting is private enough. He told me things about the remote sections of the coast that I either knew from my own experience or recognized from the accounts I'd collected, and then he said something I didn't know and hadn't heard from anyone before. He said there was a period, maybe 10 to 15 years in the middle of his career, when the encounters in the remote anchorages were more frequent than usual, more sightings, more sounds, more of the anomalous water behavior I described from the North Anchorage. He said this corresponded roughly to a period when the commercial fishery was operating at particularly high intensity in those waters, higher catch pressure, more vessels in the remote sections, more disturbance of the coastal habitat. He didn't know if there was a causal relationship. He thought there might be. He said the period of higher frequency had quieted, and that the pattern since had been what he'd call baseline, present, but not elevated. I've thought about that a lot. The implication of what he was saying, if the relationship is real, is that whatever is in those waters responds to human activity the way any animal in a disturbed habitat responds, differently, under elevated conditions than under baseline conditions. Which means it has a behavioral ecology that is sensitive to its environment in the way all organisms are sensitive to their environments. Which means it is, in the fullest biological sense, a living thing that occupies a niche and maintains a relationship with the rest of the system it inhabits, including the human commercial activity that has been operating in that system for 100 years. A living thing with a niche. That reframes everything I've described. Not something supernatural. Not something outside of nature. Something inside nature, completely inside it, as embedded in the ecology of the Alaskan coast as the brown bears and the halibut and the sockeye salmon, but occupying a part of that ecology that the commercial and scientific systems that exploit and study the rest of the ecosystem haven't adequately reckoned with, and possibly can't reckon with, given the scale and the remoteness and the behavioral complexity of what it would take to actually document something that has been successfully avoiding documentation for as long as anyone can trace. In that frame, the accounts make sense. The Alaska Native community's integration of these things into their traditional ecological knowledge makes sense. They've been living in sustained, multi-generational relationship with that coastal environment long enough to observe the behavioral ecology of everything in it, including the things that haven't been named by Western science. The seasonal and geographic pattern in my own log makes sense as range and habitat preference rather than as a series of disconnected anomalies. The way the encounters are distributed across the long-tenured fishermen I've talked to, concentrated in the most remote anchorages, in the darkest hours, in the most undisturbed sections of the coast, makes sense as the distribution you'd expect from a large, intelligent, apparently shy organism that coexists with human activity by maintaining enough distance from it to avoid conflict. It's an organism. I believe it's an organism. Undocumented, inadequately studied, present in the deep coastal waters and on the remote shores of Alaska in numbers sufficient to produce the encounter frequency I've described and the pattern of encounters that long-tenured fishermen and hunters and Alaska Native communities have been observing for a very long time. It is in the water, and it is on the shore, and it has been there through all the seasons that the commercial fishery has been running and all the seasons before that, and it will be there when I make my last transit of those waters in whatever season that turns out to be. I'm 54 years old. I've been on the water since I was 22, and I intend to work at least another 10 years if the body allows. I'll spend those years running my vessel in the same waters I've worked for 2 decades, and I'll keep my personal log with the same care I've kept it, and I'll have the conversations I've been able to have with the people I've been able to trust, and I'll accumulate whatever additional knowledge that process produces, and I'll hold all of it with the practical, professional, respectful relationship to the unknown that 22 years on the Alaskan coast has taught me is the only relationship with the unknown that actually works. The water is extraordinary. The coast is extraordinary. What lives in and along that coast is extraordinary in all the ways that word can mean. I'm grateful for every season I've had in it, even this. Especially this. Go carefully out there. Know what's in the water with you. And come home. I want to add one more thing that I've been sitting with throughout this account, and that I think deserves to be said directly before I close it. The commercial fishing industry in Alaska is one of the most thoroughly regulated and intensively managed industries in the world. There are hundreds of biologists working the system. There are observer programs that put trained scientific observers on commercial vessels to monitor catch and bycatch. There are aerial surveys, acoustic surveys, trawl surveys, tag and recapture programs, satellite tracking of vessel movement, satellite monitoring of sea ice, more data collection per square mile of ocean than most terrestrial ecosystems receive. The state of Alaska and the federal government together spend enormous resources understanding what is in those waters, because the fishery is worth billions of dollars a year and management decisions require the best available science. None of that system, with all of its resources and all of its decades of accumulated effort, has produced a documented record of what I've been describing. Not a track analysis, not a verified acoustic signature, not a tissue sample or a photograph that appears in any peer-reviewed journal or any fisheries management database. Nothing. I've thought about why that is, and I've arrived at an understanding that is more charitable than the conspiracy-minded one that some people reach when they encounter this gap. The system is designed to study what it knows to look for. The observer program monitors the catch. The acoustic surveys are designed around the known species. The aerial surveys are counting seabirds and sea otters and marine mammals that the program was designed to count. Nobody is running a survey for something that isn't in the protocol, because you can't design a survey for something that isn't in the protocol, because the thing isn't in the protocol, because nobody has officially documented it yet, because the documentation doesn't exist, because nobody has run the survey. It's circular. It's not malicious. It's the ordinary logic of scientific investigation, which requires prior knowledge to structure new inquiry, applied to an environment where the prior knowledge gap is significant and the will to acknowledge the gap has been limited by the social and professional costs of acknowledging it. The fishermen who've seen what I've seen don't report it because the reporting mechanism doesn't take it seriously. The reporting mechanism doesn't take it seriously because it doesn't have official documentation to work from. The official documentation doesn't exist because the fishermen don't report it. What breaks that circle is exactly what I'm doing here, putting the accounts on record in enough detail and with enough credible professional context that the circle has somewhere to begin being broken. I'm not naive about whether this account alone is going to result in any scientific or regulatory response. It won't, but it exists now, as part of an accumulating body of testimony from people who have worked those waters long enough to know the difference between what they know and what they don't, and every piece of honest testimony is a data point, and enough data points eventually produce a pattern that even a system designed to look away from has to reckon with. I am a commercial fisherman. I've worked the Alaska coast for 22 years. I am competent at my job, careful in my observations, and honest in my accounts. What I've told you in this account is what I've experienced and what I know, documented to the best of my ability across 2 decades and 2 personal logs filled with the specific, careful language of a professional who understood from early in his career that what he was seeing needed to be written down with precision, because precision would be the only thing standing between the account and dismissal when the time came to tell it. The time has come. That's the account. Take it as you will. One last thing. In my 20th year, the season before last, I was running an overnight transit on a calm, clear night in late September, one of those nights on the water where everything is as close to perfect as the job ever gets. Following sea, starry sky, good speed over ground, the vessel running smoothly, and the watch rotation working as it should. I was in my bunk, off watch, genuinely asleep for the first time in several days, the good, deep sleep that follows a sustained period of high-demand work. I woke at 2:18 in the morning, without any sound, without any change in the vessel's motion, without any apparent reason. I lay awake in my bunk and listened. The vessel was running normally. The engine note was steady. Nothing had changed. But I was awake with the complete, immediate alertness that I've come to associate with something in the environment having changed in a way my nervous system registered before my conscious mind caught up to it. The quality of wakefulness that is not transition from sleep, but arrival, the way you arrive somewhere rather than wake from something. I got up and went to the wheelhouse. The deckhand on watch was at the helm, watching the radar, nothing unusual on his face. He said everything was normal. I stood at the window and looked at the water. The sea was flat, completely flat, in conditions that had been producing a 2 to 3 foot following sea all night. The flatness extended as far as I could see in the available light, which wasn't far, but far enough to know that the sea state had changed around the vessel in a way that the weather forecast hadn't predicted and that the vessel's instruments weren't flagging. Just flat, held flat. The same quality I'd experienced in the bay at the North Anchorage 9 years earlier. The water managed rather than natural. I stood in the wheelhouse for 20 minutes. The flatness persisted for perhaps 15 of those 20 minutes, and then the following sea gradually reassembled around us, the normal 2 to 3 foot pattern coming back as gradually and purposefully as it had gone. And then we were back in ordinary water, and the night was ordinary around us, and I was a 52-year-old commercial fisherman standing in his wheelhouse at 2:30 in the morning for no reason he could fully explain to his deckhand. I went back to my bunk. I lay awake for a while. I got up and wrote in my log. Whatever was in the water that night in the transit lane between the island groups, it wasn't looking at us from a beach. It was in the water with us, close enough to produce the same effect on the sea state I'd observed in the North Anchorage 9 years earlier, close enough that my nervous system, calibrated by 20 years in those waters, woke me from a sound sleep before my conscious mind had any information to work with. I don't know what it wanted. I don't know if one is the right framework for what it does and why it does it. I know that it was there, and that the water told me it was there in the same way the water told me something was in the bay at the North Anchorage, and that I went back to my bunk and slept, because that's what 22 years in those waters teaches you to do. You note it. You respect it. You go back to sleep. You come home. That's all. That's everything.